Remember those festive dishes from the 1950s? The ones tucked between yellowed pages of old cookbooks, scribbled with notes in the margins? These were the recipes that made holidays feel like magic, even when times were tight. A crown roast made from ground beef, a gelatin mold that somehow stole the show, and cookies that tasted like Christmas morning. Today, we're opening the oven door to the past with 30 holiday recipes your grandparents might still dream about. Shrimp Christmas tree mold, and it wouldn't be a proper 1950s holiday party without something molded, congealed, and proudly center stage on the buffet table. Enter the Shrimp Christmas tree mold, a towering, seafood-studded spectacle that shimmered with ambition and gelatin. If this sounds like a dare more than a dish, you wouldn't be wrong. But back then, it was the height of holiday glamour. Born from a post-war obsession with novelty and convenience, molded foods were the ultimate showstoppers. Canned shrimp, cream cheese, gelatin, and mayonnaise may seem like an unlikely team today, but in a decade of Jell-O ingenuity and cocktail parties, it was practically gourmet. The mix was often tinted pale green with a few drops of food coloring and set in a tree-shaped mold, which many a homemaker bought specifically for the occasion. Once unmolded and garnished with parsley branches and pimento ornaments, it was a statement piece, part appetizer, part art installation. Making it was surprisingly simple. Cooked shrimp was chopped and folded into a whipped blend of cream cheese, mayo, lemon juice, and unflavored gelatin. Sometimes there was celery for crunch, sometimes horseradish for a kick. After chilling for hours in the fridge and praying it would release properly, it was carefully placed atop a platter surrounded by crackers or cucumber slices for dipping. Bonus points if you arranged it on a bed of iceberg lettuce. This dish wasn't just about flavor. It was about status, spectacle, and the modern American homemaker's creative flair. Hosting was a kind of performance art, and the Shrimp Christmas tree mold was a mic drop. Today, it might raise eyebrows or become a viral TikTok curiosity, but it's also a reminder of when food had flair, fun, and a fearless use of gelatin. Would I serve it now? Only if I really wanted to impress or confuse my guests. Either way, I'd be carrying on a grand, jiggly tradition. Deviled ham canapes on Ritz crackers. In the mid-century world of holiday entertaining, few combinations felt more festive or more proudly American than deviled ham spread onto a buttery Ritz cracker. It was humble, yes, but somehow also indulgent. And when arranged on a scalloped glass tray with little toothpicks standing at attention, deviled ham canapes on Ritz crackers were practically party royalty. This recipe traces its roots to a time when people were serious about hors d'oeuvres, but didn't have hours to fuss in the kitchen. Deviled ham came in a tiny can, Underwood brand being the undisputed king, and it offered a punch of smoky, spiced flavor ready to be transformed with a few fridge staples. The spread was often a mixture of deviled ham, a bit of mayo, sweet pickle relish, and sometimes a touch of mustard or Worcestershire sauce for bite. Chopped pimento or green olives added color and flair, and if someone was feeling really fancy, a swirl of cream cheese might join the party. The Ritz cracker was the perfect vehicle, salty, flaky, and strong enough to hold its own under the weight of a generous dollop of spread. Presentation mattered. Hosts would arrange the canapes in circular patterns on trays, maybe even sprinkle a few with paprika or chopped chives for that final touch of hostess pride. This wasn't just snack food. It was the opening act to a well-curated evening of cocktails, casseroles, and conversation. There's a nostalgic magic to this bite-sized delight. It was affordable, accessible, and just spicy enough to feel grown up. As kids, we'd sneak them off trays when no one was looking. As adults, we remember them as the kind of appetizer that meant you were at a real party. Today, they might feel like a retro curiosity, but serve them at your next gathering and watch them disappear. Sometimes, all it takes is a cracker, a smear of something smoky, and a little vintage charm to bring a room together. Cheese ball with pineapple and green pepper. Few dishes scream 1950s holiday party quite like a cheese ball. Round, proud, and unapologetically tacky in the best way. But the cheese ball with pineapple and green pepper wasn't just a novelty. It was the star of every snack table, the conversation starter nestled between the shrimp cocktail and the highball glasses. Sweet, savory, and just a little mysterious, this oddball of a cheese ball was a surprisingly sophisticated blend of flavors wrapped up in kitsch. At its core, this dish took advantage of ingredients every post-war kitchen had on hand. Cream cheese, canned crushed pineapple, finely diced green pepper, and just a hint of onion. Mixed together and seasoned with a touch of salt and perhaps a shake of garlic powder, it was chilled until firm, then rolled into a sphere and sometimes coated in chopped nuts for that final festive flair. The result was a soft, tangy, slightly tropical spread that no one expected to love but often did. The green pepper gave it crunch and bite. The pineapple added a brightness that cut through the richness of the cream cheese. And together it felt playful and a little adventurous, like a culinary dare that paid off. In an era obsessed with contrast and convenience, it made perfect sense. The 1950s homemaker wasn't just feeding guests. She was hosting with flair, offering something unexpected on a budget. Guests would gather around it with crackers, celery sticks, or pretzels, scooping generous portions and pretending not to go back for seconds. Some even made it ahead of time and froze it, ready to be defrosted and rolled out with minimal effort during the chaotic days of holiday prep. Today, this pineapple-studded cheese ball might feel like a relic from another planet. But give it a try, and you'll understand why it held its place on so many tables. It's creamy, quirky, and deeply nostalgic, a bite of mid-century magic that still knows how to work a room. Hot buttered rum dip served with pretzel sticks. In the age of fondue pots and fireplace gatherings, few things warmed a 1950s holiday crowd faster than hot buttered rum dip. This wasn't the drink version you might be imagining, though that too had its place in many a boozy winter celebration. No, this was a rich, sweet, boozy dessert dip, served warm and meant to be scooped with salty pretzel sticks, making it a perfect union of indulgence and crunch. It was equal parts comfort food and cocktail party mischief, meltingly smooth and just dangerous enough to feel festive. The origins of this dip trace back to the era's love for dessert spreads and rum-flavored everything. It was the golden age of imitation extracts, after all, and many versions of this dip used a splash of rum extract instead of the real thing, especially in households where little hands might sneak a bite. The base was simple but decadent: butter, brown sugar, cream cheese, and a generous splash of dark rum or its extract stand-in. Sometimes cinnamon or nutmeg was added for holiday spice, and the whole thing was gently warmed on the stovetop or in a chafing dish until it reached a molten, gooey consistency. Served in a small crock or dish and surrounded by a fan of pretzel sticks, this dip offered a flavor experience that was both familiar and intriguingly new. The sweet, spiced warmth of the dip clung beautifully to the crisp, salty pretzels, creating that irresistible sweet-salty combo long before it became a foodie cliché. Guests would hover around it, happily dipping and chatting, wiping their fingers on cocktail napkins as Bing Crosby crooned from the record player. It's the kind of recipe that feels almost made up until you taste it, and then wonder why it ever disappeared. Today, it might resurface as a TikTok trend or a retro revival board on Pinterest. But in truth, It never really left. It's just been waiting for the right cold evening and the right crowd to bring it back to life, warm, buttery, and spiked with holiday cheer. Celery sticks with pimento cheese. Before charcuterie boards took over Instagram and cheese spreads came in truffle or jalapeno bacon varieties, there was one holiday classic that graced nearly every mid-century American table: celery sticks with pimento cheese. It was simple, yes, but not to be underestimated. Crisp, cold celery filled with a creamy, tangy, slightly spicy cheese mixture was more than a quick appetizer. It was a symbol of good hosting, frugality, and just a dash of Southern charm. The roots of pimento cheese go back further than the 1950s, but that decade helped solidify its place in the holiday appetizer canon. It was affordable, versatile, and beloved across regions, especially in the South, where it was lovingly referred to as the caviar of the South. The version most common at holiday gatherings involved a base of grated cheddar cheese, a generous scoop of mayonnaise, chopped pimentos, those little red peppers from jars, and sometimes a splash of vinegar or Worcestershire sauce for depth. Some families added cream cheese to thicken it. Others swore by a touch of grated onion or hot sauce for extra zing. Celery was the perfect vessel, not only because it was inexpensive and easily available in winter months, but because its sturdy, ribbed shape was made for scooping. Its cool crunch balanced out the richness of the cheese spread and gave the dish a fresh, clean bite. Lined up on a tray in neat rows, these little boats of bright green and orange were colorful, festive, and endlessly snackable. They were also practical. A host could make the cheese spread in advance and quickly fill the celery just before guests arrived. Kids could help without making a mess, and adults could munch guilt-free between rounds of punch and pie. Today, celery and pimento cheese may seem old-fashioned, next to balsamic glazed fig toasts and avocado crostini. But one bite brings back the sound of Bing Crosby, the clink of highball glasses, and the quiet joy of a holiday table well prepared. Sometimes it's the simplest things that last the longest. Cranberry snow salad with Dream Whip. If ever there was a holiday dish that straddled the line between salad and dessert, it's the cranberry snow salad with Dream Whip. Served chilled in cut glass bowls and garnished with a sprig of mint or a dusting of coconut, this retro beauty was less about vegetables and more about visual drama. Somewhere between a fruit salad, a gelatin mold, and a sugar-drenched cloud, it offered the mid-century homemaker a dish that felt festive, feminine, and just exotic enough for company. This salad usually began with a base of canned whole cranberry sauce or crushed cranberries mixed with crushed pineapple, chopped nuts, often walnuts or pecans, and mini marshmallows. The snow came from the topping, a fluffy layer of Dream Whip, whipped into stiff peaks and sometimes folded with cream cheese or sour cream for a little tang. Dream Whip, the powdered whipped topping mix introduced in the 1950s, was a marvel of convenience and stability. It let housewives whip up fresh cream that wouldn't deflate during the party, a miracle in the age of unpredictable refrigeration and long buffet tables. Layered in a trifle dish or molded into a ring, this cranberry snow salad was as much about presentation as flavor. The bright pink base peeked through the billowy white topping like a winter sunrise. If you were feeling fancy, you'd add maraschino cherries on top or flaked coconut to mimic snow. It was sweet, tart, soft, and crunchy all at once. A holiday explosion of textures and nostalgic joy. Kids adored it. Adults took polite portions. And somewhere between the ham and the pie, it earned its place as a seasonal staple. Today, you might call it a dessert masquerading as a side, but back then it was just one more reason to be excited for Christmas dinner. It's whimsical, unapologetically sweet, and proudly old school. The kind of recipe that doesn't ask for reinvention, only remembrance. Spam baked with cloves and pineapple rings. There was a time when spam baked with cloves and pineapple rings wasn't just accepted at the holiday table, it was expected. Gleaming from the oven like a pink, glistening roast in miniature, this dish proudly blended wartime thrift with peacetime flair. It may sound like a joke in the age of farm-to-table roasts and artisanal hams, but in the 1950s, this was a centerpiece, a budget-friendly, shelf-stable marvel dressed to impress. Spam had already earned its stripes during World War II, feeding troops and households alike. But in the post-war years, homemakers got creative. Instead of hiding it in casseroles, they started dressing it up like a proper ham. And what better way to make it look like something special than to score it with a knife, stud it with whole cloves, and crown it with golden pineapple rings and those iconic red maraschino cherries. The result was both playful and oddly elegant. Spam pretending to be something fancier and almost pulling it off. The preparation was simple and theatrical. A single rectangular loaf of spam, carefully removed from the can, was sliced or cross-hatched on top, then baked with a glaze made from brown sugar and pineapple juice. The pineapple rings were pinned in place with toothpicks, each holding a bright cherry in the center, like edible ornaments. As it baked, the sugars caramelized, the cloves perfumed the air, and the spam took on a lacquered sheen worthy of a magazine spread. This wasn't just about flavor, it was about presentation and pride. For families stretching their budgets or living in rural areas, this dish made the holidays feel special. It was sweet, salty, sticky, and served in thin slices beside scalloped potatoes or a Jell-O salad. Today, it's easy to poke fun at a baked spam loaf, but there's something endearing about its sincerity. It didn't pretend to be gourmet, it just tried to be festive. And in doing so, it became one of the most charming and resilient holiday recipes of its time. Turkey loaf with cornflake crust. In the 1950s, not every family had access to a whole bird come the holidays. That's where the turkey loaf with cornflake crust strutted in. Humble, homemade, and trying its best to play the part of a proper roast. It wasn't carved at the table with great ceremony, but it fed the family, filled the house with savory smells, and brought a touch of crispy flair thanks to a generous layer of crushed cornflakes on top. If turkey was out of reach, this loaf stepped up and said, "Don't worry, I've got this." This dish made smart use of what was on hand. Ground turkey, lean, affordable, and still something of a novelty in the post-war meat boom, was blended with breadcrumbs, eggs, and condensed soup or dry onion mix to bind and flavor the mixture. Sometimes leftovers from Thanksgiving were ground up to make it, and sometimes it was turkey, in name only, stretched with whatever poultry or pork was affordable. Once shaped into a loaf and packed into a pan, the magic happened on top. A crown of crushed cornflakes, lightly buttered or sprayed with oil, added a golden crunch that elevated the entire meal. The result was a main dish that tasted like comfort and looked like effort. Sliced into thick pieces and served with gravy or cranberry sauce, turkey loaf didn't pretend to be glamorous, but it was satisfying, and that counted for everything. Housewives appreciated how it could be made ahead, frozen or doubled for larger gatherings. Kids loved the crunchy topping and the way it paired with mashed potatoes or canned green beans. In a modern world obsessed with free-range, brined, herb-rubbed turkeys, a cornflake-crusted loaf might sound like a relic. But there's something wonderfully unpretentious about it. It was practical. It was clever. It turned pantry scraps into something warm and filling. And that's the heart of so many mid-century holiday recipes. Not perfection, but presence. A warm meal, a full plate, and a reminder that good food doesn't have to be fancy to be festive. Jell-O ham ring with peas and deviled eggs. If there's one dish that perfectly captures the fearless food experiments of the 1950s, it's the Jell-O ham ring with peas and deviled eggs. Yes, you read that right. Savory Jell-O, molded meat, bright green peas, and halved deviled eggs arranged like tiny ornaments around a wobbly centerpiece. It was a dish that made guests pause, tilt their heads, and then politely ask, "What exactly is that?" But in its time, this gelatinous marvel was a culinary showpiece, a mix of frugality, creativity, and sheer atomic age optimism. At its base was a ring mold filled with a savory gelatin concoction, often made using unflavored gelatin combined with the juices from canned ham or consommé. Into that went chopped cooked ham, sometimes diced celery or pimento for color, and a dash of vinegar or mustard powder for tang. The mixture was poured into a ring mold and left to chill for hours, emerging as a shimmering pink halo with just enough structural integrity to hold its own on a party platter. Once unmolded, the center of the ring was often filled with something contrasting. Bright green peas, either chilled or lightly warmed in butter, were a favorite. But the real flair came from the deviled eggs, neatly arranged around the ring like petals or decorative garnishes. Their yolks were mashed with mustard, mayo, and maybe a pinch of paprika. Comforting and familiar, a creamy counterpoint to the salty, jiggly ham. Why did people make this? Because they could. Because Jell-O molds were trendy. Because refrigeration had finally made chilled salads and savory gelatin dishes possible for the average household. And because it looked like effort, and sometimes that was enough to impress. Today, the idea of suspended ham chunks might make us wince, but it also fascinates. It's food as sculpture, as conversation starter, as brave experiment. The Jell-O ham ring wasn't just a dish. It was a mid-century dare served cold, and somehow it still has a place in our collective culinary memory. Beef tongue in wine sauce. Holiday special. Before prime rib reigned supreme and spiral hams dominated the holiday table, many families embraced a far humbler, but no less festive cut of meat, beef tongue and wine sauce. It might not win any beauty contests, and it certainly wasn't for the faint of heart, but this slow-simmered delicacy was once considered a special occasion centerpiece. Rich, tender, and surprisingly elegant when dressed up in a glossy wine sauce, it was a dish that balanced thrift with tradition, especially in immigrant and rural communities where nothing went to waste. Preparing beef tongue wasn't a quick affair. The tongue had to be simmered gently for hours in a pot filled with aromatics, onion, garlic, bay leaf, peppercorns, until it became tender enough to slice like butter. Once cooked, the outer skin was peeled away, revealing velvety meat with a deep, beefy flavor that rivaled more expensive roasts. From there, it was sliced into rounds and simmered again in a rich sauce made with red wine, stock, and often a little tomato paste or mushrooms. Some versions called for a splash of sherry or a touch of cream to elevate the dish to something truly celebratory. What made this a holiday favorite wasn't just the taste, it was the care and time it took to make. It was a dish you didn't rush. It simmered all afternoon while the house filled with warmth and savory smells. Served with mashed potatoes or buttered noodles, it was the kind of meal that stuck to your ribs and felt like home. Of course, modern diners might raise an eyebrow at the thought of tongue on the menu, but for many families, it was a cherished tradition. A sign of respect for resourcefulness and flavor over flash. In a time when nothing went to waste, beef tongue wasn't strange. It was smart. And when topped with a silky wine sauce and served beside candlelight and laughter, it became something more. A quiet reminder that holiday magic often comes from the most unexpected places. Cranberry glazed meatballs and chafing dish. Before slow cookers and instant pots took over the modern potluck, the 1950s had the chafing dish, an elegant, slightly fussy contraption that made any appetizer feel upscale. And few dishes made better use of it than cranberry glazed meatballs, a sweet and savory bite that managed to be both festive and strangely addictive. Simmering away in their glossy ruby red sauce, these cocktail meatballs were a guaranteed hit at any holiday gathering, disappearing faster than you could refill the toothpicks. This dish was born from classic 1950s ingenuity, the idea that canned goods could be transformed into culinary magic with a little flair and a lot of sugar. The meatballs themselves were typically made from ground beef, maybe a bit of pork, mixed with breadcrumbs, egg, and onion. Once browned in a skillet or baked in the oven, they were transferred into a pan with the star of the show, a sauce made from canned cranberry jelly and chili sauce. Yes, chili sauce. It might sound like an odd couple, but somehow it worked. The cranberry brought tart sweetness, while the chili sauce added depth and just a touch of heat. Some versions included a splash of Worcestershire or lemon juice for balance, but the core pairing remained the same. Once the meatballs were nestled in their thick, sticky glaze, they were kept warm in a chafing dish, the stylish centerpiece of any cocktail buffet. Guests would circle around with small plates, spearing the glossy orbs with toothpicks and marveling at how something so strange could be so good. The sauce clung to each bite, and the combination of flavors felt both comforting and novel. Today, cranberry glazed meatballs have been rebranded as retro chic or turned into slow cooker staples, but their roots are firmly planted in the mid-century holiday tradition. They're proof that you don't need expensive ingredients or complicated techniques to make something memorable, just a few cans, a little heat, and a whole lot of bold, unapologetic flavor. Chicken a la king in puff pastry shells. In the polished world of 1950s holiday entertaining, chicken a la king in puff pastry shells was the ultimate example of casual elegance. It was creamy, comforting, and just fancy enough to make a hostess feel like she was serving high society, even if dinner was happening under a popcorn ceiling with the kids running wild in the background. This dish bridged the gap between weeknight leftovers and cocktail party fare, making it a beloved holiday classic for those who wanted something rich, warm, and just a little impressive. Chicken a la king itself had been around since the early 20th century, but it hit its true stride in the post-war years. The dish typically featured tender bits of cooked chicken, often from a leftover roast or even canned, swimming in a luscious sauce made from butter, flour, milk, or cream, and sometimes a splash of sherry. The sauce was studded with pimentos, peas, mushrooms, or green peppers, whatever added color and a bit of texture. It was the kind of recipe that looked elegant but was forgiving enough to handle substitutions, which made it perfect for the frugal but ambitious home cook. But what made the 1950s version truly special was the puff pastry shell. These airy golden cups, usually store-bought or baked from frozen, transformed the creamy chicken stew into individual servings worthy of a special occasion. Plated with care and maybe a sprig of parsley for garnish, each puff shell looked like something straight out of a department store tea room. The contrast between the crisp, flaky pastry and the rich, velvety filling was what won people over. It was indulgent without being extravagant, and sophisticated without being fussy. Today, chicken a la king might be dismissed as comfort food, but in its heyday, it was pure holiday glamour served with a ladle. It's a reminder that sometimes the most memorable dishes aren't the most expensive. They're the ones made with care, served with style, and remembered for how they made people feel. Full, happy, and just a little bit fancy. Tuna Wiggle casserole with Christmas peas. With a name like Tuna Wiggle, you might expect a children's game or a dance craze, but in 1950s kitchens, it meant dinner was served, and it was hot, creamy, and bubbling with post-war optimism. Tuna wiggle casserole with Christmas peas was a quirky, comforting staple during the holidays and beyond. It didn't pretend to be glamorous, but it delivered everything the era craved: convenience, thrift, and a little wiggle of whimsy. At its heart, this dish was built on canned tuna, usually packed in oil, folded into a simple white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk. Some recipes brightened it up with a spoonful of pimento or a dash of Worcestershire sauce, but the star was always the combination of soft noodles, salty tuna, and sweet green peas. Around Christmas time, those peas got a little extra billing, dubbed Christmas peas on more than one family menu, both for their bright color and their presence in nearly every mid-century side dish. Their pop of green gave the dish a festive look, especially when sprinkled across the top just before serving. Often, the mixture was poured into a casserole dish and topped with crushed potato chips or buttered breadcrumbs for a crispy golden crust. Sometimes it was ladled over toast or rice instead. No matter how it was served, it was warm, filling, and easy to stretch for unexpected guests, a critical feature during busy holiday weeks. For many families, this casserole was a taste of comfort and practicality wrapped into one. It made use of pantry staples and avoided the expense of fresh meat, which still wasn't taken for granted in many homes. And even if the name raised eyebrows, the dish delivered every time: creamy, savory, and just indulgent enough to feel like a treat. Today, tuna wiggle might sound like a punchline, but it holds its place in the pantheon of beloved retro dishes. It's a reminder that food doesn't always need to be fancy. It just needs to show up warm, a little silly, and ready to feed a crowd. Green bean casserole with French's onions, the original. No mid-century holiday table was truly complete without green bean casserole with French's onions. It was the kind of dish that didn't demand attention but somehow ended up at the center of every buffet. Warm, creamy, and crowned with a golden layer of crispy fried onions. Invented in 1955 by Dorcas Riley in the Campbell's Test Kitchen, this casserole quickly became a national treasure. Its genius? Taking humble pantry ingredients and turning them into something that felt like celebration. The original recipe was incredibly simple: canned green beans, cream of mushroom soup, a splash of milk, and a topping of French's crispy fried onions. That was it. No bechamel, no hand-trimmed haricot verts. Just shelf-stable convenience and a lot of creamy nostalgia. Everything got mixed together, baked until bubbly, and topped with onions for the final few minutes of baking to keep them crunchy and golden. The result was a perfectly balanced casserole, soft, salty, savory, and crisp in all the right places. It worked because it met the needs of the 1950s Adu's home cook. Fast, easy, budget-friendly, and able to sit on a crowded table without fuss. It paired well with turkey, ham, or whatever meat the holiday called for. Kids liked it because of the creamy texture. Adults loved it because it reminded them of every holiday gathering they'd ever attended. And it had just enough crunch from those famous onions to make people go back for seconds. Over the decades, the green bean casserole has been reimagined, gourmeted, and deconstructed by foodies and chefs alike. But the original holds its ground. There's a reason it survived countless trends. It's dependable, comforting, and frankly, delicious in its simplicity. So while it may not sparkle like a Jell-O mold or boast a fancy French name, this casserole is pure Americana. It's the taste of Thanksgiving, of Christmas, of second helpings and paper plates. It's not just a side dish, it's a tradition, passed down one can of soup at a time. Holiday ribbon gelatin salad, red, white, and green layers. Few dishes say festive quite like a holiday ribbon gelatin salad. With its gleaming layers of red, white, and green, It looked like a dessert dreamed up by Santa's kitchen staff. Cheerful, structured, and sweetly nostalgic. In the 1950s, this wasn't just a side dish or dessert, it was a centerpiece. Set in a glass dish or unmolded onto a platter, the layered Jell-O salad was as much decoration as it was food, shimmering with mid-century pride and seasonal flair. This recipe had a rhythm to it. Each layer had to be prepared, poured, chilled, and set before the next one could go on. The red layer was usually cherry or strawberry gelatin, vibrant and bright. The green was classic lime, occasionally made more exciting with crushed pineapple or chopped walnuts. And sandwiched in between was the creamy white layer, often made from sour cream or whipped topping mixed with unflavored gelatin and just a hint of vanilla. Some versions used Dream Whip, others folded in cream cheese for a richer texture. It took time and patience, but the result was a dazzling tri-colored dish that made guests stop and admire before taking a spoonful. The texture was half the fun. Soft, jiggly, cool on the tongue, with just enough sweetness to feel like a treat without being a full-blown dessert. It often found itself sitting proudly next to ham or turkey, blurring the lines between salad, side, and sweet. Children loved it, adults appreciated the effort, and hosts cherished how far it stretched across a table of hungry relatives. Today, a gelatin salad might seem like an outdated oddity, but one bite brings back a very specific kind of holiday magic, the kind that smells like pine needles and canned whipped cream. The holiday ribbon gelatin salad was more than a recipe. It was tradition layered in color, flavor, and the quiet satisfaction of a dish that wobbled but never fell out of fashion, at least not in the hearts of those who grew up with it on the table. Sweet potato praline ring with marshmallow flames. In the mid-century holiday spread, the sweet potato praline ring with marshmallow flames stood out like a crown, rich, golden, and unapologetically dramatic. This wasn't just a side dish, it was a centerpiece masquerading as a vegetable. Combining the earthy sweetness of mashed sweet potatoes with the buttery crunch of brown sugar and pecans, then topped with artfully placed toasted marshmallows. It embodied everything the 1950s loved about food: flavor, flair, and a little theatricality. The base of the dish was a mixture of cooked sweet potatoes, mashed until smooth and seasoned with brown sugar, butter, a touch of cinnamon or nutmeg, and sometimes a splash of orange juice for brightness. The potatoes were then carefully spooned into a ring mold, yes, a proper ring mold, leaving an empty center ready to be filled later. After baking to warm and set the shape, the ring was inverted onto a platter, ready for its signature flourish. That flourish came in the form of the flames, large, pillowy marshmallows toasted under the broiler or with a handheld torch until they browned at the edges and puffed dramatically. These were nestled either inside the ring's hollow center or spaced evenly around the top, like glowing coals. The praline element came from a buttery pecan topping that was often poured into the center or drizzled over the ring, giving it a glossy, candied crunch. The combination of textures, smooth potato, gooey marshmallow, and crisp praline made every bite feel decadent. Visually stunning and unmistakably sweet, this dish blurred the lines between dessert and side. It was designed to impress guests and convince children that vegetables weren't so bad after all. Today, it may seem a little over the top, but that's precisely what made it special. It celebrated abundance, creativity, and the joy of going all in during the holidays. One glance at that golden ring, crowned in caramelized marshmallow flames, and you knew dinner wasn't just food, it was a production. Ambrosia salad with colored mini marshmallows. There's something undeniably charming about ambrosia salad with colored mini marshmallows. In the 1950s, this pastel-hued concoction wasn't just dessert, it was a sugary symbol of domestic optimism. A darling of church potlucks, family feasts, and especially holiday tables, ambrosia brought a tropical burst of sweetness into cold winter kitchens. Thanks to its oddball combination of canned fruit, whipped topping, and, of course, those Technicolor mini marshmallows that looked like edible confetti. The recipe itself was blissfully low maintenance. Cooks opened a few cans, typically mandarin oranges, pineapple chunks, maybe some maraschino cherries if they were feeling fancy, and folded everything together with shredded coconut, sour cream, or whipped topping, depending on whether you were aiming for tang or fluff. And the real star of the show, mini marshmallows in pastel shades of pink, green, yellow, and white. These weren't just for sweetness, they were for show. In a decade that prized visual flair on the dinner table, the rainbow marshmallows gave ambrosia its festive, almost magical appearance. The flavor? A quirky mix of tart, creamy, chewy, and sweet. The coconut added texture, the fruit brought brightness, and the marshmallows gave every bite a soft bounce that made it unmistakably a 1950s treat. Some versions added chopped pecans for crunch or a dollop of cream cheese for richness, but the heart of ambrosia remained the same. It was a salad in name only, and a dessert in disguise. To modernize, ambrosia might look like a sugary time capsule, but for many it was the highlight of the holiday buffet, especially if you were under the age of 12. It wasn't trying to be refined, it was trying to be fun, and it succeeded. One spoonful of that sweet, fluffy mix could transport you back to a time of Formica countertops, Pyrex bowls, and mothers in holiday aprons who made magic from a few pantry staples. Ambrosia salad wasn't sophisticated. It was sentimental. And that, in the end, is what made it taste like home. Cornflake and cheese-stuffed tomatoes. If ever there were a dish that perfectly captured the experimental optimism of 1950s home cooking, it was cornflake and cheese-stuffed tomatoes. A blend of bright produce, dairy indulgence, and a crunchy cereal topper. This recipe was one of those surprising side dishes that somehow worked, especially during the holidays, when the table begged for color, variety, and just a little bit of flair. At first glance, stuffing a tomato might seem like something straight out of a modern foodie blog. But back in the day, it was about stretching ingredients, adding nutrition, and giving simple items a sense of occasion. Large, ripe tomatoes, firm enough to hold their shape, were hollowed out with care. Into this edible cup went a rich filling made from shredded cheddar cheese, a bit of mayo or sour cream, finely chopped celery or green pepper for crunch, and a sprinkle of onion or mustard powder for zip. But what truly set this apart wasn't the cheese, it was the cornflakes. Those golden flakes weren't just a garnish. Crushed and mixed with butter, they were folded into the filling and also pressed on top, creating a savory crumble that crisped beautifully in the oven. As the tomatoes baked, they softened ever so slightly while the cheese melted and bubbled, forming a gooey center encased in sweet acidity and topped with that crunchy, toasty crown. The result was a side dish that looked impressive but came together with pantry basics. It offered contrast in every bite, warm and cool, creamy and crisp, tangy and rich. It could accompany a glazed ham, sit beside a roast chicken, or simply hold its own as a mid-century potluck stunner. Today, cornflakes are more likely found in breakfast bowls than baked into vegetables, but this dish reminds us how creatively past generations cooked. When frugality met festivity, recipes like this were born. Cornflake and cheese-stuffed tomatoes weren't just a clever way to use what you had. They were a holiday gesture, lovingly made and surprisingly delicious. Molded lime salad with cottage cheese and olives. There was a time when no holiday table was complete without something jiggling. And molded lime salad with cottage cheese and olives was one of the greenest, quirkiest showpieces of the 1950s Jell-O era. It wasn't quite sweet, not quite savory, hovering instead in that strange, beloved liminal space where mid-century recipes thrived. Served cold and proudly unmolded onto a bed of lettuce, it shimmered like a jewel and dared you to give it a try. The base was lime gelatin, vivid, citrusy, and unmistakably bright. Into this went a blend of ingredients that modern palates might blink twice at: creamy cottage cheese, chopped celery for crunch, pimento-stuffed green olives for a salty bite, and sometimes even crushed pineapple or walnuts. Mixed while the gelatin was just beginning to thicken, the add-ins would suspend in a softly set green dome, like edible snow globes of tang, brine, and curdled charm. Some cooks used molds shaped like rings or stars for extra holiday flair, while others opted for simple glass bowls that showed off the suspended contents with pride. The taste? Surprisingly balanced, for those willing to accept it on its own terms. The lime Jell-O provided a sweet tart base, the cottage cheese added a cool creaminess, and the olives brought in a pop of salty sophistication that sounds bizarre until you try it. Texture played a big role here. Smooth gelatin, soft cheese, crunchy celery, and chewy olive slices combined into something that was never boring. This salad was a staple at Thanksgiving and Christmas, not just because it was easy and made ahead, but because it gave the table a splash of green, a conversation starter, and a break from heavier dishes. It reflected an era when presentation was part of the recipe and being adventurous meant trying savory Jell-O. In today's culinary world of deconstructed salads and microgreens, molded lime salad with cottage cheese and olives feels like a relic. But for anyone who grew up with it, it's a chilly bite of nostalgia, wobbly, weird, and weirdly wonderful. Baked pineapple and cheese casserole. Sweet and savory might seem like a modern culinary trend, but back in the 1950s, baked pineapple and cheese casserole was already boldly mixing the two, and doing it with unapologetic flair. A holiday staple across Southern tables and increasingly found in vintage community cookbooks, this dish was often served as a side alongside baked ham or roast turkey. To the uninitiated, it might sound like a dessert accident, but one bite reveals the nostalgic brilliance of its strange balance. At its core, this casserole brought together canned pineapple, either chunks or crushed, with sharp cheddar cheese, sugar, a few tablespoons of flour, and generous pats of butter. Everything was stirred together in a casserole dish and topped with buttery Ritz cracker crumbs or cubed white bread. Then it was baked until golden and bubbling. The cheese melted and the pineapple gently caramelized at the edges. The result was a warm, creamy, tangy sweet spoonful that was at once decadent and comforting. The appeal lay in its contrasts, the saltiness of the cheddar cutting through the syrupy sweetness of the pineapple, the crunchy topping giving way to the silky filling beneath. It was one of those sides that defied category. Too cheesy for dessert, too sugary for a main course, and yet perfect right where it was, nestled between green beans and stuffing on a crowded holiday plate. Why did this dish catch on? Perhaps because it felt just indulgent enough for a special occasion, but also accessible. All the ingredients came from a can, a block, or a box. You could prep it in minutes and let the oven do the rest. And during a time when stretching the budget was as important as feeding a crowd, pineapple and cheese offered an affordable touch of the exotic. Today, baked pineapple and cheese casserole may not win beauty contests or fit into low-carb trends, but it stands as a proud relic of mid-century culinary invention. A sweet, savory celebration of holiday abundance, made with love, and a little cheese. Bing cherry gelatin cake. If the 1950s had a crown jewel of holiday desserts, Bing cherry gelatin cake would be a serious contender. Gleaming, burgundy red, and packed with bold, juicy cherries, this chilled confection was part cake, part salad, part statement centerpiece. It sat proudly in the fridge until dessert time, often molded in a bundt pan or ring mold, then turned out onto a platter with a confident wobble and a crown of whipped topping. To call it a cake might stretch modern definitions, but in the era of Jell-O innovation, that was half the fun. The base of this dessert was a rich cherry gelatin, typically made from boxed cherry Jell-O, or in more deluxe versions, homemade using unflavored gelatin and the syrup from canned Bing cherries. Once partially set, the mixture was folded with an indulgent medley: chopped Bing cherries, crushed pineapple, chopped pecans or walnuts, and sometimes even Coca-Cola or cola-flavored gelatin for depth. Some versions included a layer of cream cheese whipped with a bit of powdered sugar and sour cream, which created a velvety contrast in the center of the mold. When sliced, the cake revealed beautiful striations of color and texture: glistening cherries suspended in red gelatin, flecks of fruit and nuts throughout, and the occasional surprise creamy layer. It was cool and refreshing, but also decadent in its own Midwestern way: sweet, tangy, a little fizzy, and a lot nostalgic. This was the kind of dessert that grandmas made with pride and kids looked forward to every Christmas or Thanksgiving. It wasn't baked, it didn't require eggs or flour, and it never failed to dazzle. Even those skeptical of gelatin desserts found themselves taking a second helping, just to figure out why it worked so well. In today's dessert landscape of lava cakes and macarons, Bing cherry gelatin cake may feel like a time capsule. But one bite brings back a world where recipes came from the back of a box, hospitality meant a full table, and gelatin truly was a medium for joy. Date nut roll in wax paper. There was a time when Christmas treats didn't come in foil wrappers or fancy tins. They came in wax paper, twisted at the ends like old-fashioned candies, and tucked lovingly into cookie tins or holiday platters. Date nut roll in wax paper was one such treat, a rich, chewy confection made by hand and rolled like a Yule log of sweetness. It wasn't flashy, but it was dependable, delicious, and steeped in the kind of homespun holiday spirit that doesn't need sprinkles to impress. At its heart, the recipe was simple: chopped dates, sugar, butter, and sometimes a splash of evaporated milk or a beaten egg, all cooked down into a thick, sticky paste. Once removed from heat, finely chopped pecans or walnuts were stirred in, adding just enough crunch to balance the candy-like richness of the dates. While still warm and pliable, the mixture was shaped into a log and rolled tightly in wax paper. No plastic wrap, no cling film, just that trusty, crinkly sheet that every 1950s kitchen drawer seemed to have on standby. After chilling for a few hours, or overnight if you had the patience, the roll was sliced into glossy coins of nut-speckled sweetness. It wasn't quite a cookie, not quite a candy, but it had the best traits of both: sweet, dense, a little fudgy, and satisfyingly nostalgic. No bake times, no mixers, no fancy pans, just a saucepan, a spoon, and a strip of wax paper. This treat often made an appearance on cookie trays during the holidays, offering a break from overly sugary frosted goods with something deeper, darker, and almost fruitcake adjacent. But without the bad PR, it also kept well, which meant you could stash it away or gift it to neighbors and know it'd still taste just as good days later. In a world of ever-changing dessert trends, date nut roll in wax paper reminds us that sometimes the most memorable sweets are the ones that come wrapped in simplicity, tied up with memory, and passed from one generation's hands to the next. No baked cornflake wreaths with red-hot berries. Every December in the 1950s, kitchens across America smelled like melted marshmallow and butter. Not just because of Rice Krispie treats, but because of their cheerful holiday cousin. No baked cornflake wreaths with red-hot berries. These sticky green halos weren't just festive, they were pure edible joy, made with pantry staples and a little seasonal spirit. Kids loved them, moms loved how easy they were, and everyone admired how they looked like tiny holly wreaths straight from a Christmas card. The method was simple and brilliant. Start by melting butter and mini marshmallows in a saucepan, just like a standard cereal treat. Then came the fun part. Green food coloring, lots of it, to give the whole mixture that unmistakable artificial holiday glow. Once it was well tinted, in went the cornflakes, carefully folded in until every flake was coated in that warm, sticky marshmallow slime. It was gooey, it was messy, and it was glorious. With hands greased in butter or coated in cooking spray, spoonfuls of the mixture were shaped into little wreaths on wax paper, with a hole pressed into the center of each. Before the marshmallow set, a few red cinnamon candies, those famous Red Hots, were pressed on like holly berries, giving the treat both a pop of color and a tiny fiery kick of cinnamon. The result was crunchy, chewy, spicy, and sweet all in one bite. These wreaths weren't just desserts. They were crafts, traditions, and little acts of homemade celebration. They looked like something a child might dream up if asked to imagine Christmas in candy form. And that's part of their charm. They weren't elegant or refined, but they didn't need to be. They were fun. Today they might seem retro, even kitschy, compared to Pinterest perfect cookies. But make a batch, and you'll remember why they lasted. No-bake cornflake wreaths with red-hot berries were the kind of treat that made kids' eyes light up, and holiday tables just a little more magical, no oven required. Coconut snowball cookies. Before snowflake-shaped sugar cookies took over Pinterest, there were coconut snowball cookies. Modest, melt-in-your-mouth bites that looked like little winter globes and tasted like a holiday afternoon at Grandma's house. These powdery treats weren't about drama or decoration. They were about comfort. Simple ingredients, simple process, and a result so good it didn't need icing or sprinkles. Just a dusting of powdered sugar and a gentle tumble in shredded coconut. The foundation of the recipe was a buttery shortbread dough, sometimes sweetened with a spoonful of powdered sugar, sometimes left nearly plain to let the coconut shine. Finely chopped pecans or walnuts were often folded into the dough, giving a subtle crunch and nutty flavor that peeked through every soft bite. But the magic happened after baking, when the still warm cookies were rolled first in powdered sugar, then in sweetened shredded coconut, creating a fluffy, snowy coating that stuck to fingers and made kids giggle. They weren't overly sweet. That was part of their charm. The rich, buttery dough balanced the coconut sweetness and the sugar's kiss, making them ideal for pairing with coffee or cocoa. Some versions added a splash of vanilla or almond extract, while others kept it plain and let the coconut do the talking. Presented in holiday tins or paper doilies, coconut snowball cookies had a quiet beauty. There was something soft and nostalgic about them, like the gentle hush of snowfall outside, while carols played on a distant radio. They weren't flashy, they didn't sparkle, but they were always the first to disappear at a cookie exchange. Today, they might be overshadowed by more decorated, over-the-top confections, but one bite will remind you why these were a 1950s classic. They required no mixer, no frosting bags, and no culinary degree. Just a bowl, a wooden spoon, and a willingness to get powdered sugar on your sweater. And that, in a way, was the whole point. Coconut snowball cookies weren't just about taste. They were about tradition, simplicity, and the small joys that made the season feel whole. Divinity fudge with chopped pecans. There's something about divinity fudge with chopped pecans that feels like holding a snowflake on your tongue. Light as a cloud, sweet as a hymn, and just old-fashioned enough to make you pause mid-bite and think of lace doilies, nativity pageants, and handwritten recipe cards stained with vanilla. This wasn't just any candy. It was a Southern holiday staple, a rite of passage, and an annual test of kitchen humidity and patience. Divinity is a type of nougat-like candy made primarily from whipped egg whites, sugar syrup, and sometimes corn syrup to help stabilize things. The mixture was beaten until it reached that elusive, glossy, stiff peak stage, less like a meringue and more like an edible snowdrift. The key was temperature and timing. Too humid? It would never set. Not hot enough? It stayed gooey. That's why making divinity often became a Christmas Eve sport. Only the bravest or most experienced cooks dared attempt it when the weather was damp. But when done right, it was heavenly. The outside formed a delicate crust that gave way to a soft, almost marshmallowy interior. Sweet, yes, but with a whisper of vanilla and a deeply nostalgic finish. Chopped pecans, sometimes toasted, sometimes raw, were folded in at the end, adding just enough earthy bite to ground the sugar cloud. They gave the candy texture, soul, and that unmistakable Southern signature. Mounds of divinity were dropped onto wax paper by the spoonful, often by a grandmother who wouldn't let anyone speak while the syrup hit firm ball stage. They cooled into lumpy, lovely puffs, snowballs with secrets. Occasionally, a bright candied cherry might be pressed into the top, just for cheer. Divinity may not be trendy in today's world of sea salt caramels and fancy chocolate barks. It's temperamental. It's finicky. It doesn't like the rain. But that's what made it special. It asked for your attention. It asked for stillness. And in return, it offered a bite of something that felt like it came from another world. A sweeter, slower, more patient one. That's the divinity of divinity fudge with chopped pecans. Gingerbread men with clove buttons. Before digital cookie cutters and royal icing masterpieces, there were gingerbread men with clove buttons. Aromatic little fellows baked in kitchens that smelled like spice, warmth, and just a hint of mischief. Their charm wasn't in precision, it was in personality. Each one a little lopsided, a little over-baked around the edges, and almost always with a crooked grin made from raisins, cinnamon candies, or, if you were lucky, hand-pressed frosting from a Ziploc bag with the corner snipped off. These gingerbread men hailed from a time when baking was more memory than measure. The dough itself was rich with molasses, dark brown sugar, and a medley of spices that leaned heavily on ginger. Yes, but also cinnamon, nutmeg, and the star of the show, clove. Not just in the dough, mind you. Whole cloves were pressed into the dough as buttons, giving each cookie a sharp, fragrant accent that looked festive and doubled as a natural air freshener while they baked. They perfumed the whole house, no candle required. Rolling out the dough took a bit of muscle, especially if it had been chilling overnight. But part of the fun was in cutting out those classic gingerbread shapes, pressing in their little eyes and buttons, and watching them puff up slightly in the oven, only to come out slightly darker and infinitely more lovable. There was usually a tin on the counter filled with these, their arms chipped, maybe a leg missing, and no two decorated the same. Some were painted with simple icing, others left plain, their flavor doing all the talking. A bite gave you crunch around the edges and a tender chew in the middle, followed by that unmistakable hum of molasses and spice. Today, gingerbread men might be fancier, shinier, even gluten-free. But the old-fashioned ones with their clove button eyes and dusty flower cheeks still hold the magic of a quieter Christmas. of oven mitts and aprons, of stolen cookie dough and laughter from the next room. That's the memory gingerbread men with clove buttons will always carry. Eggnog made with raw eggs and boozy bravado. There was a time when no one blinked twice at drinking raw eggs, especially if they were floating in a bowl of boozy, creamy holiday cheer. Eggnog made with raw eggs and boozy bravado wasn't just a beverage, it was a statement, a rite of passage, a punch bowl-sized flex at the office party or the neighborhood open house. This was not your store-bought, carton-capped nog. This was the homemade kind, passed down from the sort of uncle who wore suspenders and swore by fresh nutmeg and a heavy hand with the bourbon. The recipe was deceptively simple: eggs, cream, milk, sugar, and booze. Lots of booze. Usually a blend: brandy, rum, maybe a little whiskey for bite. The eggs were whipped separately, yolks with sugar until pale and fluffy, whites until stiff, and then folded back into the mix to give it that signature frothy body that danced on the tongue. No pasteurization, no caution labels, just faith and tradition and the antiseptic power of high-proof liquor. This was a drink that warmed from the inside out. Served cold, sure, but it lit up the chest like a Yule log. Families had their own closely guarded versions, and arguments were expected. Was it better aged in the fridge for days, letting the flavors meld and mellow? Or should it be served fresh when the foam still held and the egg whites hadn't sulked into the cream? Either way, you knew when someone brought homemade eggnog to a gathering. It arrived in a glass bowl the size of a satellite dish, with a ladle and enough spice dusted on top to make you sneeze. It felt illicit, luxurious, even a little dangerous. Modern tastes have turned cautious. Salmonella warnings, cholesterol fears, and lighter alternatives have all but tamed this vintage beast. But if you ever taste the real deal, thick and rich and unapologetically spiked, you'll understand. Eggnog made with raw eggs and boozy bravado isn't just a drink. It's a toast to the bold, the brave, and the holiday spirit, raw, real, and roaring with flavor. Canned fruit. Christmas morning ambrosia with sour cream. There's something delightfully retro and unapologetically joyful about canned fruit Christmas morning ambrosia with sour cream. It's the kind of dish that arrived at the holiday table in a big mixing bowl covered in plastic wrap with a serving spoon already tucked inside, because everyone knew it wouldn't be untouched for long. Made in advance and left to chill in the fridge overnight, this ambrosia wasn't just a side dish. It was a tradition, a signal that Christmas morning had officially begun. This version didn't rely on fancy fresh fruit or hand-whipped cream. No, this was frugal luxury at its finest. A mix of canned fruit cocktail, complete with those charmingly artificial cherries, mandarin oranges, and pineapple tidbits, all drained and stirred lovingly into a bowl with miniature marshmallows and a generous dollop of full-fat sour cream. Yes, sour cream. Not Cool Whip, not yogurt. The real stuff, slightly tangy and surprisingly perfect against the sugary syrup and pillowy sweetness of the marshmallows. The beauty of this dish was in its balance, a little tart, a little sweet, and very, very creamy. And it didn't ask much of you other than a can opener and a spoon. Maybe a gentle hand if you were folding it all together the night before while Bing Crosby crooned from the record player and the kids ran wild on a sugar high from opening one early gift. It was served in glass bowls, often the matching set from a wedding gift decades prior, and eaten alongside eggs, ham, cinnamon rolls, or just on its own while the wrapping paper still lay scattered on the floor. It was cold and refreshing, a little decadent and entirely comforting. In today's food world, where brunch means shakshuka or souffle pancakes, canned fruit Christmas morning ambrosia with sour cream may seem quaint, even laughable. But for those who remember it, it tastes like a moment in time, like holiday pajamas, tinsel on the tree, and the cozy hush of a morning that only comes once a year. Leftover turkey croquettes with gravy. When the wrapping paper is torn, the tree lights flicker lazily, and the big bird has been picked clean but for a few forlorn slices, that's when leftover turkey croquettes with gravy make their grand entrance. This wasn't just a way to use up leftovers. It was a post-holiday ritual, an alchemy of frugality and finesse, where humble scraps were turned into something that felt like a second feast, not a reheated compromise. The recipe came from grandmothers and home cookbooks alike. Finely chopped turkey, white, dark, or whatever was left clinging to the carcass, mixed with mashed potatoes or breadcrumbs, a bit of onion or celery, a splash of cream, or even evaporated milk. Seasonings were modest: salt, pepper, maybe a pinch of sage or poultry seasoning if someone got fancy. The mixture was shaped into neat little cylinders or patties, then rolled in breadcrumbs and pan-fried in butter until crisp and golden on the outside and tender within. But the real star of the show? The gravy. Always the gravy. Maybe it was leftover from the big meal, maybe it was whipped up fresh from pan drippings stored in a coffee mug in the fridge. Poured hot over the croquettes, it turned them into comfort incarnate. Crispy, savory, and deeply satisfying in the way only a post-holiday meal can be. Served with a spoonful of reheated green bean casserole or a dab of cranberry sauce, it somehow tasted better than the original feast. In today's world of meal kits and takeout apps, the croquette has nearly vanished, replaced by turkey paninis or next-day grain bowls. But these crispy relics speak to a time when food waste was unthinkable and flavor was coaxed, not bought. Making leftover turkey croquettes with gravy wasn't just about economy. It was a quiet celebration of what remained, a way to stretch the spirit of the holiday just a little further, one bite at a time. Because sometimes, the day after the feast is when the real magic happens. Christmas morning coffee cake made with Bisquick and nutmeg. Before anyone reached for stockings or tore into presents, there was always one reliable aroma wafting through the house on Christmas morning: warm cinnamon, toasted sugar, and the unmistakable coziness of Christmas morning coffee cake made with Bisquick and nutmeg. It wasn't fussy. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of cake that came together in one bowl with one wooden spoon and still managed to feel like a special occasion. The base, of course, was Bisquick, the mid-century miracle mix that turned everyone into a holiday baker, no matter how little time they had. Add a splash of milk, a couple of eggs, a handful of sugar, and just enough nutmeg to make it feel festive. That nutmeg was the secret. Just a pinch, but it transformed the whole thing into something unmistakably tied to December. Some families added chopped walnuts, others threw in raisins or a cinnamon swirl. But even the plainest version was soft, buttery, and smelled like comfort. Once poured into a pan, the batter got a generous crown of brown sugar and maybe a few flecks of butter or a dusting of more spice. It baked up golden and tender, the kind of treat that could sit on the counter while the morning unfolded, ready whenever someone wandered into the kitchen, still bleary-eyed in flannel pajamas. This wasn't a showstopper cake. It didn't sparkle or rise in dramatic layers, but it didn't need to. Christmas morning coffee cake was about familiarity, warmth, and the kind of quiet magic that lives in rituals. It was sliced with a butter knife, eaten on paper plates, and washed down with instant coffee or a mug of hot cocoa. Today, with brunches boasting smoked salmon towers and gingerbread pancake stacks, this cake might seem humble. But to those who remember it, it was the first bite of Christmas. Sweet, spiced, and perfectly simple. And sometimes, that's the kind of memory that lingers longest. These dishes were not about irony. They were a celebration of post-war joy, frugality, and flair. How convenience became kitsch and why some of these dishes might be due for a comeback? I'll admit it, I love the pineapple cheese ball. And maybe you will too. Like and subscribe if you love food history and forgotten feasts.